Okay, fellas, go on in.
These inductees were 10 years old when President Johnson was elected with the largest majority in U.S. history on a platform stating no American boys would be sent 8,000 miles to die in Vietnam. Since then, over 55,000 have died there. Another 300,000 have been wounded. What they'll find in the Army is a system plagued by desertion, dissent, drugs, and racial problems, thrown into disorder by the necessity of fighting an unpopular war, a war that the majority of the American people have long ceased to support. Most of these men enlisted voluntarily for a variety of reasons, some to avoid being drafted and assigned to combat, others to learn a skill in a depressed economy, many out of patriotism and a sense of duty. Some may also be running away from family and personal problems and hope to find a sense of security and purpose. But a large number might not be here except for the threat of up to 5 years in jail for those refusing induction into the service. Basic training for these men will be less harsh and stringent than a few years ago, but its purpose remains the same. The recruit's civilian identity must be replaced by a military one, highly disciplined and conditioned to follow orders without question. The Army tries to compensate for the abrupt change from civilian to military life, but doesn't always succeed.
Your arrival here at the reception station has undoubtedly left you many questions that you would like to have answered, not only about the Army, but also about the reception station. There are many things that you are entitled to by virtue of being a military individual. If you have a problem, bring that problem to our attention. We can help you solve it. There hasn't been a problem brought to us in the past that we have not been able to solve. The problem is people don't bring the problem to us. We can solve it, but you've got to give us a chance to. Bring your problem to us. Remember at this point, we can help you if we know you need help. Somebody in the Army can do it for you.
On guard. Yeah. Check it out.
But even a well-disciplined military, given the best of conditions, has little time to attend to the personal problems of its men. Its main goal is to produce effective soldiers, soldiers who will fight and kill, and be killed if necessary. Inevitably, dissent overflowed from public debate into the military. Those with anti-war convictions, as well as those with strictly personal or family problems, frequently find their problems become worse under the stress and isolation of basic training. The result has been organized protest in the ranks and the highest desertion rate in over a century. From 1967 to 1971, according to Defense Department figures, 315,000 men deserted from the military. The majority of these deserters eventually return, but the others are gone, moving around America, hiding out underground or in our ghettos. Worried about pursuit by the FBI, they assume new identities and cut themselves off from everything they've come to know in the first years of their lives. Many, after months of apprehension and anxiety, find they can no longer live the double life of the fugitive, and they head north to Canada. Harboring draft resistors, deserters, and dissenters is not a new phenomenon in the modern history of relationships between Canada and the U.S. In the early part of World War II, many Canadians fled south of the border and were not extradited. Similarly, the Vietnam War has led many Americans to seek a haven in Canada, especially here in Toronto, where estimates run from 30 to 40,000 of the suspected 100,000 draft-age Americans in Canada's urban centers. Since the first wave of draft resistors in 1966 and 67, the influx of new immigrants has been steady. But in 1969, the majority of those coming to Canada became military deserters. The Toronto Anti-Draft Program is one of Canada's largest counseling centers. Here, the newly arrived exile learns what documents and preparations are necessary in order to stay and work legally in Canada. In the past, these groups have told resistors not to look back, to forget about ever being able to return legally to the States, and to concentrate on getting adjusted to Canada. Now, however, the talk of amnesty is intensifying the aggravations of those exiles with difficult problems, and the anti-draft counselors spend as much time dealing with those who wish to return as they do with those arriving.
The whole situation in Canada has changed, so the counseling has changed. We do something that we call priority counseling, which is basically making people aware of their alternatives. There was a time where TADP encouraged just about everybody to come here and immigrate. That's no longer the case.
The majority of the people we see are deserters. Now, it varies from week to week how many we'll see. Like, there'll be weeks when you might see only maybe 4 or 5 new arrivals, and then there'll be weeks when we're just swamped. A lot of it depends upon what's going on in the States as to how many we see. The majority, overwhelming majority, are deserters. We still see a few people with draft delinquency, but they're gradually, in terms of percentages, becoming a smaller number than prior. The deserters are the main number we see.
How long do you think people are going to continue to come up here?
As long as the war goes on.
Although American resistors are spread out across Canada, they do have a central forum where their hopes and grievances can be aired. Amex Canada magazine, published by Americans exiled in Canada, came into existence in 1968 at the University of Toronto. The magazine now plays a leading role in the amnesty debate from the exile perspective. D. Knight, formerly of San Francisco, is the managing editor. He left college to work full-time in the 1968 McCarthy campaign and, like many others, was deeply disillusioned by the Chicago Convention. Having been turned down as a conscientious objector himself, D. feels the majority of exiles are politically motivated.
There's over 100,000 people, young Americans, many of us intelligent, and very committed people, committed to changing the world, who are exiled in Canada or Sweden or France and many other places around the world. You know, our parents know that it's political, and they're burying their heads in the sand because they know it's political. When I came up here, you know, before I did anything about coming here, my mother said, "Oh, son, I just hope you don't get in trouble with the government." And I told her, I hope the government doesn't get in trouble with me, but it looks like they have. And our parents have been completely afraid of the political realities. They've known that if we start acting according to our beliefs, we're going to get in trouble with the government. So our parents know that it's political that we're here. You know, they know that it's political the first time that we start questioning war policy. You know, and they also know that it affects our lives in very practical ways.
Do you think that many of the people up here, supposedly 100,000, 50,000, are assimilating into Canadian life?
Yes, of course. I mean, I just heard you say that a lot of people you talk to seem to be very shiftless. This year they live in Toronto, next year Vancouver, always waiting to see who's going to take the next move for their life. I've been here now for 3.5 years, and people say that it's only the deserters who are shiftless. I say that when I came here, the vast majority were draft resistors. Many of us were also shiftless. Many of us hung around places like the old Union of American Exiles or other hostels or meeting places, wondering what's going to happen, who's going to take control of our lives now, you know, what's going to change in the next year. And people waited and waited and didn't get jobs and didn't do anything, just waited for something to change. And pretty soon, they realized that the only person that can control their lives is, number one, they themselves. And then they go out and get jobs. Then you find them no longer associating only with Americans in Canada, going about their lives as if they belong to them, rather than waiting for the American government to reclaim them. We don't have time, you know, to wait for it. After a year or two, a person gets himself settled. Hopefully, a person still remains honest to himself. and remembers why he came here in the first place.
Although many war resistors quickly find a place for themselves in the Canadian community, others experience extremes of loneliness and disorientation when they arrive. Adjustment is sometimes impossible without the comfort offered by others sharing the same feelings. Often, they'll occupy a house and live together in order to ease their assimilation into Canadian life. Wellesley House, operated by deserters, is one such house. Jerry Hughes and Jeff Egner have lived there for the past year, helping other deserters with their problems.
Well, that's what it is primarily. It's a house that American draft dodgers and deserters come to when they first come to Canada. It's a cheap place to stay and a place to, you know, get their shit together, as they say back in the Army, to get landed, to get some kind of roots in Canada, get a job, and also to be in contact with other people who are going through and, you know, have gone through much of what they have to go through. It's very easy for you to come up here and to spend so much time thinking about what you've just gone through and what you've lost that you don't start doing the work of putting roots down in Canada, which is important.
I think eventually everyone should get up and try to assimilate with Canada. You have to retain your identity. You know, you're still an American, and it's nice to retain some sort of cohesion with the people, you know, who are like you. You're the other Dodgers and deserters. And I think the only function of Wellesley House is to be sort of a stepping stone on into Canadian life.
When you joined the military, you swore an oath to defend your country. How do you justify breaking that oath?
You don't go and do something which you consider wrong because sometime in the past you took an oath to do that. Some people find the Army a very radicalizing, eye-opening experience. I did. And you know, once I got in there and found out that duty, honor, and country meant participating in a system which was impressing people for 2 years of service and asking them to give up their God-given right to life, you know, like the Declaration of Independence says, to go over and kill people for no reason. When I found out that, you know, that oath meant, it didn't mean shit to me anymore.
The United States has got some perverse sense of pride that they would rather go on massacring people rather than admit the colossal blunder they made in Vietnam. And to me, this is insanity, and I would do the same thing again. I have, you know, no doubts about that, although I would like to live in the United States.
I'm glad to be gone. I have no desire to return. I would like to see my family, you know, and I would like to be able to return. But I you know, there's no desire for me to, on my part, to go back and rejoin American society.
The feelings of alienation and culture shock suffered by deserters and draft resistors during their first months in Canada haven't gone unnoticed in the Canadian medical community. At the Toronto Hospital for Sick Children, for instance, Dr. Saul Levine, a psychiatrist in residence, has made an extensive analysis of the psychological difficulties facing war exiles.
In general, the parents were opposed to their move up here. And it's very difficult to make a move like this without the encouragement, or at least permission, if not help from your parents or others who are meaningful to you. Those who got into most trouble up here, psychiatrically or legally or socially, seem to be those with the least support, not only here, but back home in the States. Some of the parents disagreed, but still provided love, encouragement, even financial help. Others wrote the kids off, saying, look, I don't want to see you again. Don't darken our doorstep, you're disinherited. I know of a few suicides. You know, they are in the age group that has the highest suicide rate in general. One of the leading causes of death in the 18 to 25-year age group in general is suicide, and they happen to fit into that age group. So that's one thing. Another reason, of course, is that it's a tremendous stress. They are removed from their home, from their loved ones, from a very familiar culture, and thrust into an alien environment. And if they came up with no contacts, no preparation, and with false expectancies of what is going to happen up here, they're going to be really upset. A lot of them come up here very suddenly, without adequate preparation, not ready for the Canadian scene, not ready for antagonism from Canadians, not ready for being thrust in a kind of lifestyle that they may not be used to. They just go through a very stressful period, and some of them see it as a time that suicide becomes one alternative. Antisocial behavior is another. Serious depression is another.
Eddie Hillier came to Toronto in 1970. For an entire year, he, like many others, lived underground in fear he wouldn't qualify for immigrant status and would be sent back to the States and the stockade. Eddie is one of the 10,000 to 20,000 exiles who are living underground in Canada, cut off from legal and visible means of support. Totally transient, these men have little hope for the future without an amnesty.
I quit school, and like I was ready for the draft. I just couldn't wait to get in. I lied because I wanted to go in. I was afraid I was going to be a reject. Then I got in, you know. I found out that I screwed myself. And I didn't know how to get out. I thought, like, Canada was the way to escape what I couldn't handle. And when I came across the border, I felt, wow, I'm free. But then I noticed that there was no difference. I felt really believing like this isn't going to be a lifetime thing. The reason why I feel like going back, I've been really so depressed in the last few days because it feels just like it did before when I was AWOL. Like, I really don't think that I would go back. But it's just the way that I feel I want to go back, you know? And yet I don't want to go back because I know what's going to happen when I do. Go to jail and sit there and just rot for a while. It could be better if I went back. I'd be fed 3 times a day, you know? Money wouldn't be any problem because I wouldn't need it in the jail. I'm just getting tired of panhandling and not eating 3 meals a day and losing weight the way I am.
Dick Burroughs, a native of El Paso, Texas, came to Canada in 1969 after his application for conscientious objector was turned down. He, like many others, was unable to convince selective service of the sincerity of his beliefs. For Dick, who now counsels at the Toronto Anti-Draft Program, being rejected for his beliefs by his family and friends, as well as by the local draft board, was a painful and disillusioning experience.
Nobody would listen. I had to sit for hours and say the same thing over and over again to drum it into my mother's head, that I wasn't trying to destroy a family or anything, that I was merely trying to make a decision on my own that I felt was correct. Somewhere along the line, I think about in January, I changed from going into the jail to coming to Canada. And it was very easy once I found out about Canada, because I saw no point in going into jail for laws that are unjust. The summer was really a bastard, the whole 3 months, because I had the personal hassle with the neighbors, I had the family hassle, and I had a hassle with the draft board at the same time. Right before I was ready to leave, I had gone through the interview. I had instantaneous 1A after that. And I was making plans to leave. And I was walking down the street, and a girl my age, a close friend for a number of years in the neighborhood, was sitting on her step, and I walked over to sort of say goodbye to her. She's getting married the next couple of days, and I couldn't stay for her wedding. We had been fairly close, and she just decided then to give me a piece of her mind. She said I was ruining my life, that I didn't know what I was doing, that I had picked up a lot of ideas about the world and about the movement and about Vietnam and everything from the long hairs at school, and that I hadn't looked into it myself. I just sat there and took this. And I went back up to the house, and I just sat down in my room and cried a while, because I couldn't believe that she had done this. That plus an actual confrontation with my parents on the night before I left sent me flying from El Paso very readily. I never want to go back to that place. I consider 2 friends there, and the rest I can do without.
According to the Pentagon Papers, the military opposed the initial U.S. involvement in Vietnam, but was overruled by civilian planners. Military leaders feared an Asian land war couldn't be won and would destroy morale. Today, the consensus is that the prediction was correct. Caught in what is essentially a political dilemma, the military has very little idea of how to resolve the problems which the war has brought upon it. At the Pentagon, Colonel Victor DeFiore of the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense talks about the problems of desertion and claims only a small number of deserters is motivated by anti-war feelings.
Generally, you'll find men departing because of personal, family, or financial problems, perhaps romantic entanglements, perhaps an inability to adjust to the military situation. Some will leave because they are about to be disciplined for some reason. A small number will leave because they are aliens who are either disenchanted with the United States or the U.S. military and wish to go home. A small number, a very small number, perhaps in the neighborhood of 4.5% or so, leave because of political or anti-Vietnam reasons.
At the present time, how many men does the Pentagon have listed as deserters?
The total number of military deserters is slightly over 35,000. Those who have gone to foreign countries number about 2,200.
Where are the rest of the men?
I have to say, presumably, they're in the United States.
The desertion figures given by the Pentagon differ greatly from those offered by counseling groups across Canada, which claim a current influx of 80 war resistors a week, the vast majority deserters. Any army must be highly disciplined in order to be effective. Discipline, however, requires that soldiers believe they're making the sacrifice for a worthy cause. When a genuine and popular cause is lacking, even the harshest discipline will not suffice for long. This is at the heart of the military's problem. The widespread feeling among GIs of the uselessness or even the wrongness of the war is a leading factor, exiles claim, in the high desertion rate. At Fort Dix, Drill Sergeant Thomas B. Croner, an Army veteran of 17 years, sees it from a different angle.
See, they've got their own beliefs today. These beliefs sometimes conflict with, modern day policies. I don't really feel that any man should take it on his own. I mean, there are ways, constitutional ways, there are ways of expressing himself. Here, he doesn't have to leave as a form of protest. Like I say, I could care less what the man really thinks, right? I do feel that any man has some obligation to someone. Now, whether that is to himself or to his family, to his nation, whatever he wants to relate it to. And I don't think running is an answer.
You're a Vietnam veteran, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Some of the men in Canada seem to claim that they're the real heroes of the war by refusing to serve, by refusing to go into the combat zone. How do you feel about a statement like that?
No, I really couldn't understand something like this, This is something, that's their way of thinking. If they feel that by, being heroes of the war, without really, I think, understanding, without really understanding what this thing is all about, what the war was all about. The best thing I can say is I've been there. A lot of us have been there. Okay, true, maybe some people don't like it. I don't say I like it. I'm not going to say, that I like going into a situation like that, right? But I've been there and I've seen with my own eyes. Oh, they have too. They've gone over and they've had people of their own over there, and they always relate to picking out whatever, they can about different things that have happened over there. But I've seen more to support what action was taken over there, even though some people today think it's, you know, a wasteless thing or a useless thing.
But not all men who went to Vietnam found it so easy to say, "I've been there." Jerry Samuels enlisted out of a deep sense of patriotism, but once in Vietnam, he quickly discovered a gap between his expectations and the reality he faced. After a 9-month tour of duty, he was unable to justify the killing and senseless brutality of which he himself was a part. Since deserting to Canada, Jerry has suffered from a deep sense of guilt and depression for his past actions.
It was pretty chaotic. There were a lot of villagers running around screaming and yelling, trying to get away from us. At first, there wasn't any gunfire at all. Just a lot of kicking around, pushing around, slapping, trying to get the villagers into one area for interrogation. I don't know exactly what happened or what caused the first shot to be fired, but after a while, when I was trying to contain a few of the villagers myself in the crowd, I started hearing rifle fire, M16 fire, short bursts, a couple long bursts, and a few Vietnamese every now and then would hit the dirt, you know. And in the excitement, I pulled the trigger a couple of times myself, and blew down a couple of women, a couple of men. It started to quiet down after a while, and there was a couple of the GIs, including a sergeant, was leading a couple of the Vietnamese girls away from the area where the activity was, and outside the village wires, they had razor wire around the village. And there was 4 or 5 GIs. I don't know if the word rape is appropriate or not. There wasn't as much force as one might think. It was just a matter of not verbally asking them for anything, just making the motions, and the 2 girls submitted right away to all of us. I got, we might call disgusted after a while, and kind of could see myself doing what I was doing and in the situation as it was, and I felt a tremendous sense of guilt right there. I started to walk away while a couple of the other GIs were standing around watching what was happening, and I heard a couple M16 burst, and 2 girls were shot right there while they were laying on the ground. One of them was sitting, one of them was laying on the ground. Afterwards, it was, I did feel like there should have been some kind of punishment right there. It was almost a religious thing, you know. I wanted some, you know, God to stop me, you know, right there or something, but it didn't happen. That was the first time I thought of war crime, you know, war crime. I'm a war criminal, and what have I done, you know? Not in the context of can I get in trouble for it. I wasn't worried about whether or not as a matter of fact, I kind of maybe wanted to get in trouble for it, you know, because out of the guilt for doing it. But I kept asking myself, I mean, I was allowed to do this. There was a non-commissioned officer present. He participated too. And I did re-enlist, that thought in mind, thought of deserting. And my mind wasn't completely made up. I kind of felt that I should go home and maybe talk it over with, of all people, with my mother, who I never have known too well because I've been in foster homes. But she had written me faithfully more than anyone else while I was in Vietnam, and I got to know her a little bit more by mail, I guess, than and in person. And she was one of the most understanding people that was writing to me while I was there. So I did go home on that 30-day leave. I found myself unable to talk to anybody about it. I didn't tell one soul at all when I got home that I'd thought of deserting. As far as everybody was concerned, I'd just gotten a leave as some kind of reward. And I was at home for a while, and I would have to go back to Vietnam. This is what all my friends and family thought. I went to my wife. I visited her a few times. I stayed with my mother most of the time because my wife and I, like I say, the reason I joined the Army was to stay away from her for a while. I did go to her and see her. I went to her with the thought in mind of telling her that I plan on deserting and then asking her to go with me. I just chickened out. I couldn't do it. I just kind of closed my eyes, turned my back, took a deep breath, and got on a train for Canada. Someday, the war crime testimony that I'm gathering from the deserters will surface into the straight news media. And I hope it'll do something, open somebody's eyes or ears. And maybe it'll end the war by 5 minutes sooner, I don't know. Maybe it'll cause some degree less pain over there somehow, I don't know. It's all out of the sense of guilt I have to admit that, for what I did, for what I saw, and also the disappointment I have in my home, my mother country, you might say.
Several weeks after this interview was filmed, Jerry Samuels attempted suicide and later returned to the United States, where he gave himself up to the military. Amnesty legislation has been introduced in the Congress which would enable draft resistors to return to the U.S. without having to serve a jail sentence. Representative Edward Koch, a Democrat from New York City, was the first sponsor of this type of legislation. Representative Koch, however, doesn't believe unconditional amnesty, that is a general pardon for offenses committed against the government, can be given at this time.
Great candidate, he'll make a great president. Let's hear it for George McGovern.
Almost all presidential candidates have taken positions on amnesty. One of the most outspoken critics of the war, and understandably the first candidate to speak in favor of amnesty, is Senator George McGovern. He would grant an unconditional amnesty for draft resistors and a case-by-case review of all military deserters.
The question was to clarify my position on amnesty for those who have stood up against the draft, either by going to jail or going into foreign exile. Well, what I have said is that if I were President of the United States, my first action would be to order an immediate end to our military involvement in Southeast Asia. And the second thing I would do would be to follow the precedent set by Abraham Lincoln 100 years ago and declare a general amnesty. Call it forgiveness, if you will, but a general amnesty that would relieve young men that have stood up against this war of any further guilt, of any further prosecution under the law, either for those who went into foreign exile or for those who went to jail. I think we have to do what we can once this war is over to reconcile the nation. Now, the other side of the coin is that we owe a special obligation to the veterans coming back from Vietnam. The present rehabilitation program is entirely too stingy and inadequate. It does not provide adequate educational benefits. We are not offering adequate medical care. We are not guaranteeing job opportunities and job training, and all of those things ought to be done for these young men returning from Indochina. So I think it's a double problem of reconciling both the veteran and those who stood up on the war.
But what's going to happen to the tens of thousands of deserters? As things stand now, if they give themselves up and return to the U.S., they face military prosecution and the stockade. At Fort Dix, most of the men in the stockade are those who had deserted or gone AWOL and had been apprehended. At the Fort Dix Personnel Control Facility, Major C.W. Cauley deals daily with the problems of AWOLs and deserters.
Supposing a man is up in Canada, what kind of treatment can he expect when he comes back?
On his return, of course, he'll have to be processed through our judicial system, of course, military, and ordinarily, he would arrive at an organization similar to what we have here, a personnel control facility. And a personnel control facility has already been stated. It is just an organization set up to process individuals who have been dropped from roles of their regular unit.
Do you think that sometimes the political motives can be just justifications to other problems caused him to leave?
And that's what I was thinking originally. Say 5 years ago when we first started the big build-up in Vietnam and so forth, that many people went across into Canada. And my first impression on this was that politics had very little to do with the reason why they didn't want to go to Vietnam or serve in the service. And so some people have called it cowardice, something along those lines.
How do you react to that?
It's kind of hard to say. Pardon me?
How do you react to that charge that these guys are cowards?
How do I react to it?
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I don't have a reaction to it because I wasn't charged with it. I've been there twice.
Yeah.
But rather than go, facing the unknown again, the fear of the unknown, some people just weren't able to take it. Of course, who wants to be participating in a war? It's a terrible thing, and it always has been. It will be in the future. So that's where that is right now.
Yeah, but you wouldn't characterize the men who've gone to Canada necessarily as cowards?
No, a lot of them really have a belief that politically they are correct, and what they've done is justifiable along those lines. And I can only say that's their opinion, and I perhaps have mine.
What about granting some kind of amnesty for these men? A lot of the guys we spoke to would like to come back, but frankly they're afraid of what's going to happen to them if they do. They're afraid of the stockade, they're afraid of punishment. What about granting them some kind of amnesty?
Well, one of my personal opinions on that would be, if we indeed could grant amnesty, let's also figure out a way to resurrect the people we have, or should I say resurrect the dead and cause the wounded to be cured who have been hurt in Vietnam, and do all those things at one time. Being that we cannot resurrect the dead, I can see no reason why we should give a general amnesty to anyone else. They should have to come back and face the law as it has already been put out. It's already written as exactly what should take place with the individual who has gone to AWOL and has been dropped from roles from his unit in the service. The people who are afraid, let's say, to come back, mainly, as I said, are afraid of the unknown. They don't know what's going to happen to them when they come back. And I can only say that whatever happens to them when they come back isn't going to be the most terrible thing in the world. As a matter of fact, it'll be the beginning of a new day for most of them.
Even if they're put in the stockade?
Even if they're put in the stockade, you've hit me with that before. Some reason or other, somebody thinks the stockade is a terrible place. It is not necessarily the most terrible place in the world. The place has good accommodations, and you can see we're building a brand new correctional facility right across from us here. And it's the most modern facility in the area as far as correctional holding facilities are concerned.
So you would recommend that men in Canada come back and face up to whatever they have to back in the Army?
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. I would say to anyone in Canada that come back as soon as possible, that nothing here is so terrible that you can't come back. After all, this is still their home, and they're going to be looked at that way and be taken care of. No problem.
Ken Powell is a Seventh-day Adventist who came to Canada from a small desert community in Nevada. He never finished high school and is only semi-skilled. When he refused to go to Vietnam, Ken was court-martialed and sent to the Fort Ord stockade, where he claims he was beaten several times before he deserted. At the time of this interview, Ken was working for room and board in a small farm community about 40 miles outside Toronto.
At that time, it was, and still right now, it was part of my religious convictions, you know, for not going over. And I just couldn't, my brother, my stepbrother, I should say, went over and he was killed over there. So, and I couldn't see it. I couldn't see why sending my brother over and then sending me over there after he'd gotten killed, you know. When they stuck me in the hole and started beating me up, I was scared and everything. I tried to commit suicide twice. When they come in that last day before I went to the hospital, this one guy come in there and started to hit me over the head with the billy club, and I jumped on him and I bit his throat, you know. So that goes to show you how close I was to really going insane. Their way of having fun was by beating me up and torturing me, you know, by dropping matches on my stomach, lighted matches and everything, you know. And I don't know, I guess they just got a kick out of it, you know. I can't say that I'm happy. I can say that I feel a lot better than I would be if I was back in the States in a stockade or in jail somewhere.
Would you want to go back?
I would if they'd grant me amnesty. Yes, I would.
Yes.
While politicians and exiles propose various forms of amnesty, some including both resistors and deserters, others dealing only with draft resistors, The official Department of Defense position is that this is not the time for an amnesty.
On your question, I do not believe now is the time to consider that question of amnesty. That question should not be considered until every young American has been returned from the prisoners of war camps, or we have a complete accounting for every man missing in action in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, and even the enemy has signed those conventions and refuses to abide by them. While there is a single American involved in combat operations and being drafted into our service and going to serve his country in accordance with the laws of this nation, this is not the time for us to consider that question. That question will be considered at its proper time, but it certainly should not be considered at this time when Americans who are abiding by the law and who are giving service to their country, who are captured and living in jails and prisons, these young Americans who are willing to serve their country, until those questions have been answered, I would not be for addressing that question of an amnesty for those that have violated the law.
The leaders of the war exile community in Canada advocate a general, unconditional amnesty. At a recent press conference in Toronto, they rejected several of the current, more punitive amnesty proposals.
We reject the current amnesty proposals in the U.S. because they serve to mask Nixon's escalation of the war. They do not include the same provisions for deserters from the armed forces as they do for draft dodgers. They all have a punitive string attached called alternative service, and they all imply guilt on our part when we were the ones who refused to commit the crime. What we are talking about is a totally non-punitive restoration of complete civil liberties for all persons charged, persons who might be charged, and/or persons convicted under any American municipal, state, federal, and/or military law due to actions related directly or indirectly to the Indochina War. In this unprecedented war, there is no honor for American heroes, just victims. The dead and injured GIs are victims, just as we are. America right now has reached a consensus in opposition to the American war policy. We were the ones that began initiating this consensus. Why should we be the ones that are punished?
Yeah, the question is... Mr. Knight, would you be content to stay in Canada then?
I'm not going to answer that question.
Why?
Because I know that I have the right to return to the States if I wish. I also know that I have a home now in Canada. I also know that I have loyalties in Canada, as I have loyalties in the States.
Well, there are a lot of people in the United States who would say you abandoned the country, that you have no legal standing there.
Well, all we can answer to that is that we've been as loyal, if not more loyal, to the country than anybody there. We have also been far more loyal to the country than the war planners, than the government leaders who have continually lied to the American people.
How do you feel you've been more loyal?
By refusing to be tricked by the American government policies and by remaining true to the ideals on which America was established.
Here's a question, Mr. Honestly, is your estimate or your opinion of the chances of the American people accepting this kind of a proposal from you, you know, especially those people who have lost sons in the war?
We can trust the American people to understand who's really to blame for the loss of their sons' lives in a useless and worse than useless cause. I think that the current figure is 73% of Americans have come to a realization that the American war policy in Indochina was at least wrong. I think that an increasing number of people understand that the thing was a matter of deceit from the beginning.
In our first interview with Dick Burroughs, he said he had no desire to return to his home in El Paso. But now he has a family of his own in Canada, and his responsibilities are greater than just to himself and his convictions. Like many other young men who went to Canada and settled there with relative ease, Dick now finds himself in a complex situation, again faced with a difficult choice to make.
What would you do if there was an amnesty? Would you want to go back?
Well, it depends on what kind of amnesty. If it's punitive at all,
I'd have a hard time. I would really like to go back, but, you know, I would find it very difficult to compromise, you know, by accepting a punitive amnesty, particularly one that's like 3 years. I'm up here because of the war in Vietnam and U.S. involvement in Indochina. And to go back before the U.S. is out is negating why I came up here. And I'm not about to do that.
There are at least 200,000 draft resistors, deserters, and convicted men who would benefit from a general amnesty. Some are underground in the United States, others are exiled around the world, still others are in our prisons and military stockades. The reasons for these men being in a fugitive state may be family, social, or political. The fact remains they resisted a war which the greater part of America, including its political leaders, has come to view as a tragic mistake. The men who died in Vietnam cannot be brought back. The reality is that part of a generation has been wasted by sending them to war, by forcing them into exile, or by punishing them because of their beliefs. After a decade of war, a way must be found out of the morass to restore order and social justice in America.